Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the channel, or welcome if this is your first time here. Let's start the video with these iconic images. Yes, plural, when it comes to the Commodore 64. Now, if in previous videos we've talked, without going into detail, about what Commodore was and what Commodore is today, in today's video we'll tackle a topic that doesn't ask which one, but rather how many. So we'll be asking ourselves the question, just how many Commodores are there? And in fact, as we can see from the images, over the years, several different Commodores have emerged from within the enthusiast community, and in this video, we'll analyze them one by one. Stay with me until the end if you're interested in this video because I'll be sharing some details and a few updates. Well, I also wanted to mention the RetroShack channel because it actually started giving me this idea, and I recommend you watch their video in more detail. However, on my own channel, I try to expand on the topic, add more details, and focus on some specific points. Now, first of all, let's review one by one the various possibilities and the different Commodore models that have existed throughout history, from the early days of Commodore all the way up to today, 2025. Let's start with this brief overview, and as you can see, I've already expanded the tabs in the browser. So, first of all, let's begin. The Commodore 64. And this is our iconic image that we refer to, an 80s home computer that accompanied us through many years of our youth. And it was the first among the most advanced 8-bit computers, or at least in history. At the time, Commodore Business Machines was one of the most advanced companies. This serves as a starting point. Then we have what is called the SixtyClone, which we also have for sale from the boards, the motherboards, so to speak, for those who might want to, through PCBWay or other such suppliers, manually build what is, in every respect, a Commodore 64. So we have the historical aspect, and we also have this part where, let's say, those who are more experienced, whether in repairs or the technical side and soldering, can easily build one themselves. And we'll get to that as well in terms of prices, items, costs, and so on. Furthermore, we also find when it comes to the BMC, this bare metal, some other alternatives where we can see this bare metal applied to the Commodore 64, the Commodore 128, and other features. And here as well, it's based on the Raspberry Pi, and we'll go on to define it in more detail later. But of course, that's not all. Let's take a look at what the C64 is. This too, in any case, was, let's say, an initiative by RetroGame, who provided us with the Commodore 64, initially with a Commodore 64 Mini. Then we got the Commodore 64 Maxi, and now there's the release of the Commodore 64 Black, a black edition. And here too there are various features, and we will go through and analyze all of them, of course, including the features, prices, and costs. But that's not all. Of course, we also have, among others, the ultimate one. Gideon's Logic, which I'm not sure how to pronounce, it could also be Gideon's Logics, but surnames are a whole different matter. And here we see what is called the Ultimate Elite, one of the most advanced motherboard boards, let's call them that, for the Commodore 64. And on this website, you can purchase all the various parts needed to reassemble the Commodore 64. So here too, we have other alternatives. Is that all? No, definitely not. Let's take a look. Recently, the revived Commodore, now acquired by BW, brings us this new Commodore, still based on the Commodore 64 Ultimate. However, while here there is a partnership with Gideon's, where you have to build it piece by piece, in this case, you get the entire machine fully assembled. This is yet another feature and option available in the retro world and for us enthusiasts. But is that all? No, definitely not. We will also look at a retrospective on the Commodore 64 evolution, which here again offers us a highly advanced product. Now let's go back. Obviously, more than 20 million Commodore 64 units were sold. You can still find them at small flea markets on eBay from private sellers. Basically, they're still available and even today at a fairly affordable price. Unlike some Amiga models or other computing devices that in more recent years, let's say, have experienced, due to the significant nostalgia effect, a rather disproportionate and substantial increase in their overall prices. Now, let's get back to us and talk about this basically SixtyClone that is creating a complete Commodore computer system from scratch, piece by piece. this is undoubtedly also the most rewarding part, but also the most expensive part. As I mentioned, it requires soldering skills and, of course, the search for components, which can be either original, new, old stock, or even modern reproductions. As I was saying, there's mention of the availability of motherboards like this one, for example, from SixtyClone, and so to speak, the replacement of almost all the chips. So SID, PLA, CPU, and so on. Technically speaking, and this is a very rough and preliminary estimate, we're looking at around $550 or euros, give or take 50, perhaps even 100 more or less, just to give you a comprehensive idea of the approximate cost involved for meticulously purchasing all the necessary individual parts and components, and of course, for the intricate and detailed process of carefully assembling and precisely soldering them all together as well. Let's continue. As I mentioned earlier, this solution is based on a kit that combines a hardware interface, as I was saying, with a real keyboard, specifically the one from the Commodore 64, and a Commodore 64 case, along with emulation software, the BMC 64. And as you can see, there are also versions for the 128 and so on. Inside, we have an execu. What you see here is actually a Raspberry Pi. It's an option that in fact offers an authentic experience and clearly, compared to the previous one, comes at a significantly lower cost. We can also talk in pounds, dollars, or euros. Technically, we're around 270, give or take 50, depending on the euro, dollar, or pound conversion. It must be said that, well, this undoubtedly doesn't support the original peripherals, but it does support the original joystick, and that's definitely an advantage. All right, let's continue. But before moving on to the Mini, well, we can still stop at the C64 Maxi, published by Retro Games, so by Retro Games Ltd. This computer is a modern replica and has sold about, if I'm not mistaken, around 300,000 units. It has an HDMI output, a very simple user interface, includes about 64 pre-installed games, and you can also load them via USB. It can also emulate a VIC-20. Among these options, it is undoubtedly the most affordable one, and technically we're talking about around 130 pounds or 130 euros or dollars, give or take a little. You can even find it today at a significantly lower price. On the other hand, of course, it doesn't offer any support for the original hardware, that's for sure. All right, let's continue and move on to what is, so to speak, the ultimate option. And obviously, this is the Ultimate Elite 2, which is the most feature-rich choice. It's an FPGA motherboard, that is, a field programmable gate array created by Gideon's Logic, which offers full hardware and software compatibility with the original Commodore 64. Here, we're really at 99% compatibility. It supports HDMI output, and as you can see here, we also have the option to install two real SID chips, both the 6501 and the 8501. By the way, here too, we have emulated Ethernet and Wi-Fi connectivity, but it needs to be assembled. As for the cost, we're technically around 400, 420, 430 pounds or euros, a bit more or a bit less, but here as well, some technical skills are required. Excellent. We also have this product, which is the new Commodore that has come out. And so it now has an official Commodore firmware. This, let's say, is the main new feature with pre-orders available. We'll also take a look at how far they've gotten, but if I'm not mistaken, we're at around 6,000 units. So essentially, it's a meticulously pre-assembled version with an official and legitimate license from the newly established and revitalized Commodore company. It comprehensively includes the original authentic ROMs, a high-quality durable keyboard, the innovative Bing board, and a classic bread bin case, which is readily available in three distinct and visually appealing formats, as you can clearly see here right before your eyes. There's the original classic grey Commodore format, a luxurious gold version, specifically called the Gold Edition, as you previously observed and saw earlier, and an interesting in-between option featuring a transparent case clearly shown and displayed here for your viewing. The price, of course, is very, very competitive, also because, as you can see here, it's around $299. Obviously, we also have to consider that if we compare this price to those in America, it's really quite affordable, since salaries there are generally higher. If we look at the price in Europe, the cost becomes a bit more significant, and if we consider other regions, this price starts to feel even heavier in other countries, naturally. In any case, it's definitely a truly cutting-edge and highly effective solution because it allows me to acquire the ultimate system with all the essential components already conveniently pre-installed for a remarkably low cost, and that's certainly a significant advantage. Obviously, you have to go here, always talking about retrospective, and needless to say, here we have the very best. Because I believe this is, in any case, the most advanced counterpart when it comes to the Commodore 64, Retro has evolved because this is the retrospective of Commodore Evo. Clearly, you can easily see here a significant amount of 1404 and so on. I'll just point out, if you carefully look over here, these specific items, a substantial $800, a further $300, a smaller $44, and a considerable $500. Clearly, the components are of an extremely high quality. We even have a tube sound, but here beyond meticulously building the Commodore manually, because at the present moment I don't know if there's a truly complete version available, I would still need to thoroughly check the official website. We're talking about incredibly expensive components. So it's very, very easy to significantly go over $1,000, if not even reach around $2,000. However, this particular price, let's say, can be quite misleading because I haven't yet precisely calculated all the various essential elements needed to have either a basic functional version or a truly full comprehensive version. But let's say that anyone who ultimately goes for this premium product obviously won't be satisfied with just an economical stripped down version. Anyway, let's now delve into much more intricate detail. All right, back to us. As you can see, we're on the Tindy Computer website, and I wanted to focus on building a Commodore from scratch. Here, well, on their site, there are, let's say, many components available. However, I'd like to meticulously point out that when we comprehensively talk about building a Commodore from scratch, we're not usually referring to a singular, exclusive supplier. Instead, we're primarily talking about carefully assembling various essential components from a multitude of diverse companies operating within the dynamic microcomputer sector. Here, by the way, I've thoughtfully made a detailed selection regarding the different crucial aspects of meticulously building a complete Commodore 64 from scratch. As for the fundamental motherboards, people frequently use modern, highly accurate replicas, original vintage boards, or even specialized boards like the ones I prominently showed earlier, such as the 0.0420 or innovative projects like the Bivouac. Moving on to the protective case, the external, often iconic shells. Where genuinely possible, you could certainly use an original authentic shell, but they are also expertly produced by the reputable German companies ICOM and Retrofunction. Then regarding the essential keyboards, there are many modern, high-quality mechanical keyboards specifically designed for the Commodore 64, which have become exceptionally well known and highly regarded among dedicated enthusiasts, like the incredibly popular MechBoard 64 or the distinctive Bling board. A particularly sore point, and here I've clearly marked it as exceptionally rare, are the crucial chips. These vital chips are indeed rare and notoriously hard to find, and the more modern, contemporary ones are basically advanced FPGA-based solutions. Even for the iconic SID chip, there are some genuinely valid and interesting alternatives available. Well, I say valid alternatives, but really they're just alternatives because when it comes to the unique SID, we have the SwinCD, the ARMSID, and the Sidekick. Now, I say alternatives, but not really truly valid ones because the distinctive and unparalleled sound of the original 6581, I firmly believe, still hasn't been perfectly emulated. It was a truly perfect and groundbreaking sound for its specific time. Let's definitively put it that way. As for the PLAs, we now have modern equivalents for all of them. The 6510 processor is replaced by the JCPU, and so here we get into the whole area of emulation. The VIC II chip, well, there's a project called Cavalry for that. And what else can I say? What can I say at the end of all this? Building a Commodore from scratch is really a project for enthusiasts. You have to get hands-on, use a soldering iron, and gather the components. This is definitely the most rewarding of all the projects I've presented so far, but it's also the most expensive and perhaps the least economical, unless you consider it from a retrospective point of view. I wanted to pause here briefly. Maybe we'll also select the page for the 128, the BMC64. The bare metal is built, there you go, by a single company, but it's essentially an open source project created by Randy Rossi. This software allows you to emulate a Commodore 64 directly from, as you can see, a Raspberry device without an intermediate operating system, which is why it's called bare metal. You can still connect the original Commodore 64 keyboard and have the option to connect joysticks. This is the 128 section. I don't have it, but it's really nice, this part. Moving on, regarding the DC64, I'd say there's nothing more to add except that it's a faithful reproduction of the original Commodore 1.1. You can still connect joysticks. In fact, a wireless joystick edition was recently released. You can also load games via USB. The firmware is upgradable, and there are other features as I mentioned. And today, the Black Edition has also been released. I'd say there's nothing more to add here. All right, let's move on to guidance logic. So here there's a whole section of documentation right on their website. You can check it out on GitHub. I'd say I won't dwell on this because just explaining the features of the Ultimate 64-2, which I already briefly mentioned at the start of the video, would basically turn this into a whole separate video. At most, I could only give a very general overview of its primary and most important features, but here, of course, everything is explained in much more comprehensive and extensive detail. Nay? And then I'd say let's move on, of course, to the Commodore 64 business machine, the official Commodore 64 from the newly reestablished Commodore. And it's our old Commodore, of course. Before moving on, I wanted to give you a bit more information about the Ultimate, and here too I've made a little note for myself. Clearly, the Ultimate 64 has what you'd call full hardware functionality with a declared 99% compatibility. It also supports multiple SIDs. You can install both a 6581 and an 8581, although I personally prefer having two complete 6581 SIDs. It includes all the outputs you'd expect, definitely HDMI and everything else. And to connect modern keyboards, it also has USB ports where you can plug in joysticks, USB drives, and so on. It has built-in Ethernet, wired Wi-Fi, and an important slot to access original Commodore 64 cartridges. Classic support for .t64 and .prg files. It also has a good, actually I'd say excellent, GUI interface. The configuration is flexible, as we've already mentioned. Integrated emulation for the 1541 and 1551 drives, support for REU, and therefore also for speeding up programs. This is important as far as the firmware is concerned, and especially for the extension of the card's own capabilities, as well as for fixes, debugging, and regular firmware updates. This is really important. Well, while I'm at it, first of all, I also wanted to show you the sales chart for the Commodore 64 Ultimate, specifically the sales tracker. Obviously, there was a lot of hype here. Undoubtedly, within just a few days, we almost reached what you could call a plateau, even though now, let's say, a small advertising trend has also started. Sales have basically started to increase again. It was thought and assumed that they would reach a plateau and then stabilize, if not with just a few units sold. But from what I can see, the trend is still growing and we've already reached 8,000 units. Then here, of course, the various units are also divided among the Founders Edition, the Starlight Edition, and the Beige Edition. Here, obviously, as for the Founders Edition, there are only 6,400 units available, all of them numbered. Well, I'd say let's wrap up the video with the Commodore 64 Evo. Well, now I couldn't end this journey through the various Commodore models with anything other than the Commodore 64 Evo. Let's say it's not a pre-assembled computer, but rather a project for a replacement motherboard for the Commodore 64. It's designed for hobbyists and enthusiasts. I'd even add hardcore fans who want to build a Commodore 64 using the original chips or their FPGA substitutes or clones on a completely new motherboard with advanced features. It's a project entirely created by the community, and you can find it on the Retrospective shop. The real strength of this project is its modularity and expandability. And inside, as you can see here, the motherboard provides a whole series of, so to speak, sockets to expand it and also to install the original chips. So the 6510, the 8500, the VIC, two SIDs, the PLA, the RAM, and the ROM, and so on, as well as some very advanced outputs for the new tube, which are, of course, tube preamplifiers, tube pre-preamplifiers, HDMI outputs that break away from the traditional jailbreak when it comes to the Commodore 64. The build quality is obviously extremely high. Who is it aimed at? At enthusiasts, hobbyists, but I would say that this product is let's say, aimed at hardcore users who want the very best from their Commodore 64 and are also willing to spend a significant amount, but who then end up with what is undoubtedly an exceptional product in their hands. Now, let's go back to our cover image of the Commodore 64. I've given you an overview of all the different Commodore models, of how many Commodores there are. I hope that this video, whether short or not, was enjoyable for you. If you enjoyed this, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it if you want. And if you appreciated this research I've done so that I can bring you more videos of this kind, or maybe even more in-depth ones where I might be able to add more resources to the time I have available to always bring you, let's say, videos that are technically and qualitatively superior. I just want to say thank you all for sticking with me this far, and I'll see you soon on Project CD Chronicles. Claudio?